Brr. Have you ever woken up to frost on the windows or seen your breath in the cold air? Winter in the UK can be icy, sometimes even snowy enough for snowmen and snowball fights. But why are some winters much colder than others? It's not just because it's winter. High above us, there's a powerful swirl of super cold air called the polar vortex. This secret weather superhero connects the coldest places on Earth with our own back gardens. When you hear about the polar vortex on the news, you'll know it's behind those extra chilly days. We're about to explore what the polar vortex is, where it lives, and how it can make our winters extra frosty. We'll even try some fun experiments to see how cold air and wind work. So grab a warm drink and get ready to become a polar vortex expert. Imagine the Earth as a spinning ball, twirling gracefully in the vastness of space. Just like a dancer wearing a hat, our planet has its own special hats at the very top and bottom. But these aren't hats you can see or touch. They're made of air, and they're incredibly cold. At the North and South poles, it's as if the Earth is wearing invisible freezing hats. These chilly caps are called the polar vortex. They're not made of wool or fabric, but of swirling icy air that circles high above the ground, far above where airplanes fly. The polar vortex is a massive area of fast-moving, super cold air. It acts like a giant fence or barrier, keeping the coldest air trapped close to the poles. Imagine a huge, invisible wall, stopping the freezing air from escaping and spreading everywhere. Inside this icy fence, the winds spin incredibly fast, trapping the cold air, just like when you spin a bucket of water and the water stays inside, even if you turn it upside down. The spinning motion keeps everything in place, swirling and swirling high above the ground. There are actually two polar vortices, one swirling over the Arctic in the north, and one over the Antarctic in the south. Each one is strongest during its own winter, when the sun barely rises and the cold is at its most intense. For example, when it's winter in the UK and the days are short and chilly, the northern polar vortex grows bigger and stronger, locking in the cold air over the Arctic. These icy swirls are always present, quietly shaping our planet's climate and weather patterns. They help decide how cold it gets in different parts of the world, and even influence where storms might form. The polar vortex isn't a storm with a name or a single event you can watch on the news. Instead, it's a giant, high-up wind pattern that's been swirling around the poles for millions of years. Ever since Earth first had seasons. Scientists have studied the polar vortex for decades, using satellites, weather balloons, and computer models. Lately, we hear about it more often because sometimes the vortex gets wobbly or stretched out. When that happens, it can break open and let blasts of icy air escape, bringing wild winter weather to places that aren't usually so cold. When the polar vortex wobbles and sends cold air far from the poles, cities and towns can suddenly find themselves in the grip of freezing temperatures and snowstorms, even if they're usually mild in winter. That's when we really notice the polar vortex at work, when we have to bundle up in extra layers, scrape ice off our cars, or watch snowflakes swirling outside our windows. So, where does this chilly giant live? Let's take a closer look at the mysterious frozen regions at the very top and bottom of our world, and discover the secrets of Earth's icy hat. The polar vortex lives high up in the atmosphere, swirling around in the stratosphere and troposphere. These are layers much higher than where airplanes usually fly. If you could somehow soar above the clouds, you'd still be far below the home of the polar vortex. It's like a giant, invisible ring of wind, circling the poles far above our heads, quietly shaping the weather below. You can't see the polar vortex itself, but you can definitely feel its effects, especially when it decides to send a blast of icy air down to where we live. That's when you notice the sudden chill, the biting wind, and the need to bundle up in extra layers. It's the reason for those surprise cold snaps that make you shiver, even if the sun is shining. The northern polar vortex sits over the Arctic, covering places like the North Pole, the icy Arctic Ocean, vast stretches of Canada, the snowy wilderness of Russia, and the frozen lands of Greenland. These regions are some of the coldest on Earth, and the vortex acts like a spinning shield, trapping the frigid air above them. In winter, these areas experience polar night, when the sun doesn't rise for weeks or even months. With no sunlight to warm the ground, the air becomes extremely cold, and this intense chill helps the vortex form and strengthen, swirling faster and tighter as the darkness continues. The southern polar vortex spins over Antarctica, which is even colder and more stable than the north. Antarctica is the coldest place on Earth, and its vortex is like a powerful, icy fortress, rarely disturbed and almost always locked in place. Both the northern and southern vortices form during their respective winters, when the sun disappears for months at a time. This long, dark season allows the cold to build up, creating the perfect conditions for these swirling winds to take shape and dominate the polar skies. Most of the time, these polar vortices stay put at the very top and bottom of the world, acting as guardians that help balance Earth's temperature. They play a crucial role in keeping the cold air contained so the rest of the planet doesn't freeze. Warm air from the tropics is always trying to move toward the poles, while cold air from the poles wants to escape toward the tropics. The polar vortex helps manage this exchange, working with the jet stream to keep the cold and warm air in balance, shaping weather patterns all over the globe. Think of the polar vortices as the planet's chilly gatekeepers, usually keeping the cold locked away behind an invisible barrier. They're like nature's own security system, making sure the coldest air stays where it belongs. But every so often, the gatekeepers slip up, and a piece of that icy air escapes, rushing south and bringing a sudden freeze to places that aren't used to it. That's when you hear about the polar vortex in the news and when you really feel its power. Imagine the polar vortex as a giant, invisible spinning top, high above the Earth, an enormous swirl of icy air circling the North Pole. Just like a toy top, when it's spinning quickly and smoothly, it's stable and balanced, holding its position right over the Arctic. When the top spins fast, it doesn't wobble or drift. In the same way, a strong polar vortex stays put, keeping the coldest air locked up far to the north, right where it belongs. The edge of this spinning mass is marked by the jet stream, a powerful, fast-moving river of wind that races around the globe, high above our heads. It acts like a fence, circling the vortex and keeping the frigid air contained. When the jet stream is strong and forms a tight, circular path, it acts as a barrier, trapping the cold Arctic air inside and preventing it from spilling southward. The strength of the vortex comes from the huge temperature difference between the frozen Arctic and the much warmer regions to the south. This contrast fuels the spinning motion, making the vortex powerful and stable. When the vortex is strong, the UK enjoys a typical mild winter. People stroll outside in light jackets, and the weather feels calm and familiar. No surprises, just the usual chilly days. But what happens if the vortex weakens? Imagine the spinning top starting to slow down. It begins to wobble, losing its balance and stability. Sometimes, sudden warming high up in the atmosphere, known as a sudden stratospheric warming, can disrupt the vortex. This causes the jet stream to lose its tight shape and become wavy, bending and twisting instead of circling smoothly. These waves in the jet stream act like open gates, allowing huge chunks of cold Arctic air to break free and surge southward, reaching places that are usually much milder. It's a bit like opening the door to the planet's freezer. Suddenly, all that icy air rushes out, chilling everything in its path. Occasionally, one of these cold waves dips right over the UK, sweeping across the country and bringing a sudden blast of Arctic air. Temperatures plummet and the weather can change almost overnight. That's when we experience our coldest, snowiest days, when parks and streets are blanketed in white, and everyone bundles up to face the chill. These dramatic wobbles of the polar vortex are what make some winters unforgettable. Families gather to build snowmen, children play in the snow, and people reminisce about winters past, sharing stories of extraordinary cold snaps. So the next time you see snow falling or feel an icy wind, remember, it might just be the polar vortex paying the UK a visit. Let's find out what happens when this spinning top of cold air heads our way. When the polar vortex wobbles, it can send a mass of Arctic air straight to the UK. This isn't just a little cold, it's the deep freeze that usually stays over the North Pole. These events, called sudden stratospheric warmings, break down the vortex and let cold air spill south. The result? Temperatures drop fast and we can get days or weeks of snow and ice. Remember the beast from the east in 2018? That was a classic polar vortex wobble. It doesn't happen every winter, but when it does, meteorologists can often see it coming and warn us in advance. So, when you hear the polar vortex is on the move, get your hats and gloves ready. The Arctic and Antarctic are two of the most extreme places on Earth. The Arctic is a frozen ocean surrounded by land, home to polar bears, Arctic foxes and the midnight sun, when the sun doesn't set for months. In winter, the sun doesn't rise, creating the polar night and allowing the vortex to form. People like the Inuit live in the Arctic and have adapted to its icy world. Antarctica, at the South Pole, is a huge continent covered by a mile-thick ice sheet, holding 70% of Earth's fresh water. It's the coldest, driest, and windiest place, with temperatures as low as -89 degrees. No one lives there permanently, only scientists at research stations. Penguins, not polar bears, rule Antarctica, sharing it with seals and whales. These frozen lands are the true homes of the polar vortex. Ready for a science experiment? Let's see how cold air moves. You'll need a clear box, 2 cups, red and blue food coloring, and hot and cold water. Ask a grown-up for help. Fill the box with room temperature water. This is our atmosphere. Add blue food coloring to cold water and red to hot water. Gently pour the blue, cold water at one end and the red, hot water at the other. Watch, the blue cold water sinks and spreads along the bottom, while the red hot water floats on top. Cold air is heavier and sinks, just like the blue water. Warm air rises, like the red water. This movement creates currents, just like wind in our atmosphere. That's how the polar vortex can send cold air our way. Let's try another experiment to see how wind makes things colder. This is the wind chill effect. You'll need 2 ice cubes, 2 plates, and a fan or cardboard for wind. Place an ice cube on each plate, leave one alone. Fan the other with your wind, which melts faster. The one in the wind. Wind blows away the cold air around the ice, letting warmer air melt it faster. That's why a windy winter day feels colder than a calm one. When the polar vortex brings cold winds, wind chill makes it feel even frostier. When the polar vortex brings a chill, stay safe by dressing in layers. Vest, jumper, coat, hat, scarf, and gloves. Layers trap warm air and keep you cozy. But don't let the cold keep you inside. Go for frosty walks, look for animal tracks, or build a snowman. Warm up with hot chocolate after playing outside. Try science experiments. Leave water out to freeze overnight or blow bubbles on a freezing day to see them turn to ice. Frost patterns on windows are like tiny icy ferns. Nature's art. The cold brings a whole new world to explore. Next time you hear polar vortex, you'll know it's a giant swirl of air high above the pole. When it wobbles, it can send Arctic air to the UK, making our winters extra cold and snowy. So, wrap up, stay safe, and enjoy the frosty fun. Science is everywhere, even in a winter breeze.